Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whittaker, and this time I'd like to do something a little bit different, which is to do a deep dive into one topic, and that is, why doesn't Japan have a military? Now, obviously, if you go back in time, Japan, of course, did have a military, very much so. They had a military before World War II, and they surprised the world by defeating both China and Russia in conflicts, which sort of made everyone sit up and take them seriously, pay attention. And they rapidly acquired through military conquest an empire that included Hong Kong, Manchuria, the Philippines, Taiwan, etc. However, after their defeat in World War II, they were occupied by the Allies and then essentially made to by the Allied powers and General MacArthur to adopt a new constitution imposed on them, along with a few legal scholars, essentially giving up their military. So let's have a look at this constitution. So the relevant article that says they can't have a military, or is considered to say that, is Article 9. It's got two parts. And so it says, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Yeah, so that's Article 1. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war material, will never be maintained. The right of the belligerents of the state will not be recognised. And so that seems pretty clear in that they're renouncing, in particularly Article 2, the right to have a military. So a couple of things to note with that. Number one, it says war. It doesn't clarify aggressive war, expansionist war. There's no mention of any sort of exceptions. It just says war. It also appears to explicitly ban, through those terms, in Article 2, Army, Navy, Air Force, all things that should be noted that Japan essentially has. That being said, Japan, this article is entirely on the books. It's not been revoked in any way, and Japan has all three. The SDF, Japan's Self-Defense Force, has land, air, and sea forces, and it's been considered over time one of the top 10 militaries in the world, despite this essentially being forbidden under Article 9. So how big is the Japan's Self-Defense Force? It's approximately 260,000 people. So a substantial military then, although it's not called that, it's branded as a self-defense force to sort of get around Article 9, which is interesting because, as I say, there's no mention of aggressive war or war outside of self-defense, or any mention of self-defense. This self-defense thing seems to have just been popped up as a clarification by the Japanese state to say it's somehow different to what Article 9 says, but it really says all war and all war potential should be banned. So it's interesting that they've gone with this as a way of sort of justifying it, of just calling it a self-defense force. So one thing to consider is, was this written in sort of an optimistic way, and perhaps was the idea that Japan should never have a military, was that what was considered when they were writing it, despite it looking fairly clear when you read the text itself? Well, if you look particularly, the preamble to the Japanese Constitution says, we shall secure for ourselves and our posterity the fruits of a peaceful cooperation with all nations and the blessing of liberty throughout the land, and resolved we shall never again be visited with the horrors of war throughout the action of government, which suggests that it very much is motivated by pacifism. This isn't just one rogue article that's been inserted. It seems like it's fairly considered that they were going for sort of a pacifist approach. Nor is there anywhere else throughout the Japanese constitution that I'm aware of any sort of provision for military or armed forces. The two articles I read out don't mention any sort of exception, and there's no clarification as to how Japan would defend itself if it were attacked, or what alternative it might use as opposed to having a military. It simply says that Japan's constitutionally barred from having one, land, sea, or air forces. It seems pretty clear. There's no sort of clarification or in that respect. It just is very plain, no military allowed. And it's very interesting that it was the Americans and General MacArthur that seemed to sort of out of nowhere. I think this was somewhat of a surprise at the time when he introduced this. He seemed to very much have taken it upon himself to be very motivated to pass this Article 9. I think because in the context, obviously, of World War II, Japan at the time was seen as a sort of a defeated power that obviously the USA had been to war with. Which is quite ironic because at times I think the USA has become to be a bit frustrated with Japan and the fact that they can't sort of contribute to sort of global peacekeeping efforts, and that they have very much held on to this Article 9, which the Americans themselves introduced into their constitution. So it's quite ironic in that respect. I think for Iraq, as one instance, they might have wanted Japan as sort of a coalition partner, but Japan was barred by Article 9 to really not be able to fully participate in that respect. So I think the sort of face of things changed very quickly when the Americans began to see communism as sort of the main threat, rather than sort of a nationalist Japan or other nationalist countries. They sort of saw communism as sort of the global threat not long after, and Japan became more of a partner in that respect. So perhaps the Americans might have regretted including that Article 9, but nonetheless it's still very much in the books, it's still very present for them. And so the fact that this was somewhat of a surprise, the fact that there wasn't a lot of preparation for this, maybe has led to this current situation that this Article 9 was inserted. It was MacArthur's desire to do this, that they perhaps didn't plan through or think what would happen 10, 20, 30 years down the road, what the alternatives would be, what would happen if Japan was placed under threat. Perhaps it was sort of seen as imperative to prevent a situation, to give one example, like Germany, where Japan might rearm itself. It was seen as imperative maybe to stop that happening in the near future, but they perhaps didn't think down the road what's going to happen if the situation changes, and what an alternative would be to Japan in the long term having a military. But despite it being a surprise, you can't say really that no one was aware of this when the constitution was being passed. No one thought about it. To give one example, the Japan Communist Party, who I've mentioned in the past, oldest party in Japan, they did oppose this or raise concerns about it. They basically questioned the practicality of abandoning war, even for self-defense. They said, what do we do as an alternative, which is quite a reasonable question to ask. However, the phrasing around it makes it pretty clear there's no self-defense capacity, which is what the Japan Communist Party, I believe, at the time were concerned about. So you can't say the Parliament, when passing the constitution, were unaware of it because there were objections raised at the time. It's not that this is something that could have really, you could say, surprised Japan. Something that was raised during the debate, which has been used as a bit of a fig leaf to get around this and to sort of enable Japan to say, we should have a self-defense force, it's not entirely unconstitutional, is the phrase which was inserted by one lawmaker, which was aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order. That was added to Section 1 by a Japanese lawmaker, Hitoshi Ishida, called the Ishida Amendment. And there's nothing, I think, in there that really clearly says, cancels out the very clear wording of, you can have no land, sea or air force. But it's been used, this phrase, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, to say, that sort of implies maybe we should have a self-defense force. But there was no real clear, I think, clarification of that at the time. And there was no sort of spelled out reason for the intent of adding that extra wording. But in a world where Japan, for practical reasons, needs some sort of defence, feels it needs a military, but it's very difficult to just repeal the entire constitution. That as a pretext, and this sort of unclear phrasing there about justice and order, maybe just gives them, like I say, a fig leaf, a pretense to hang on to say, that's our reasoning, that's our legal argument for saying this is a little bit unclear. This is despite the Section 2 part of no air force, land force, etc., very spelling out in a very practical way that you can't realistically have an army, and making it basically impossible to have any sort of self-defense without those elements that you need in a modern military. So why was this passed? Why did not more people other than the Japanese communists sort of object to this? Well, one fact is that Japan was very much exhausted by the after effects of the war. Many people wanted to rebuild economically. Japan was very much exhausted, and so they saw Article 9 as maybe a way of saying, being a clear way of preventing over-militarization, returning to the military and spending money that way. So in that sense, Article 9 was sort of seen as a big asset for Japan because, we're barred from spending any of our revenue on a military. Let's instead on perhaps lowering taxation or regenerating the economy, getting things going and rebuilding the nation after the Second World War. So in the short term, it was seen as very advantageous, although obviously this has long-term effects on Japan, its lack of a military, that is. So that perhaps is a motive for sort of seeing this issue, but just letting it slide at the time. Much as perhaps the Americans maybe came to regret this, they were at the time motivated by ensuring Japan wouldn't remilitarize. For the Japanese, there's that clear motive in the short term of, well, it prevents us from falling back into militarism and spending all this money on the military and enabled us to rebuild. So there's short-term motives there, while some people were clearly aware of the long-term impacts this might have. There's also an additional motive, a third motive of public opinion, which is that the pacifism clause, I think, was fairly well received at the time. People didn't like the idea of going back into, after being totally exhausted by the Second World War, of the prospect of future war. And so I think it was broadly fairly popular. Although at the time there were all these motives, as I say, in the long term, this is perhaps something that's become an issue. And the first stage of this was, I believe, in the 1950s. And this is the Korean War, where Japan obviously, and again, this ties back to the idea that at first the Americans thought nationalism might be their biggest threat after World War II, which makes sense given the war they just fought. But then they came to, within a short, but not too long a period of time, see communism as a threat, which is very much the case in the South Korean War. That was what they saw as their big concern, and they saw Japan in its key location right next to Korea as a potential station, and they suddenly became very concerned about this, and so they began to tacitly approve of the rolling back of the Article 9, which they themselves imposed, and the Japanese people also moved forward to sort of roll this back a bit. So MacArthur, who was still there as sort of the occupying administrator of Japan in during this period, he was forced to move armed forces stationed in Japan to Korea. So previously, obviously, while under American occupation, you had the Americans there. Again, in the short term, you don't have to worry so much about any threat to Japan having passed this Article 9 when you've got American military forces there. But once they're gone, obviously, you have to think about, well, what happens if there's a riot, if there's a potential invasion, if any number of things happened. We don't have any military, and now the Americans sort of have their eye on Korea. And so the first step, really, to roll this back was the Yoshida, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, is established the National Police Reserve. This consisted of 75,000 officers, and it also included heavily armed vehicles. So really, it's more of a militarized police than just, peacekeeping arm, an expedient to keep order in the streets. Heavily armed vehicles makes you think that it's a sort of a quasi-military force, even if you don't call it that, which is the first step, really, to sort of realizing that you've made a mistake and to sort of tacitly roll this back. It's not reintroducing a full military, but it's a first baby step to introduce this sort of militarized police force. And then the National Police Force turned into the National Safety Force in 1952, which is a second step to sort of formalize this rollback. And again, it's called a safety force. So you're not calling it a military yet, but it's moving closer there and more away from the police, in my opinion, with that naming, I think. By calling it a safety force. And then in 1954, the government enacted the SDF Act, which really takes us a lot closer to where we are today, which is introducing the National Safety Force and converting it to the SDF, the Land Self-Defense Force, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, and the Air Self-Defense Force. And remember that wording in Article 9 of no land, sea or air force. So we've really come a long way in just a decade to essentially rolling that back, despite at this point there being no change whatsoever to the Constitution. You now have a land self-defense force and a maritime and an air self-defense force, and they're using that self-defense word to sort of get around it, despite there being no exception made whatsoever in the Constitution for self-defense. But that's the pretext they've gone with. That's what they're using. And it seems like on a sort of a necessity basis, everyone is just sort of letting this go because they understand it's what they have to do. Now, at first, there was some resistance to this, not so much from a legalistic standpoint, but I think some people were sort of worried or had a negative opinion of following Second World War, sort of rolling back. As I say, the idea of pacifism was fairly popular. But I think the fact that the SDF engaged in natural disaster fighting led to a bit of a shift in public opinion, basically. They saw it as, okay, I can see clearly the situation in which this sort of thing might be very necessary. And so that sort of softened it. And obviously over time, you can make an argument that as this has become more established, it's more part of the status quo, people will just gradually come to accept it, despite Article 9 not having been revised in any way. It's the reality of life in Japan that there is this self-defense force, which is effectively a military. And so there comes to be this sort of consensus to just ignore the constitution effectively and just let it carry on. This isn't to say there was never any sort of legal challenge to the status of the SDF. It did come under question, particularly under Article 9, Section 2, which bans any sort of military power capable of engaging in a war. However, the government stance was effectively that said that it wasn't breaching the constitution because the SDF did not have the capacity to engage in a full modern war, and that the maintenance of war potential does not prevent them from having the military amount of a military to defend the country, despite that being nowhere in the constitution and being the constitution very much spelling out that there should be no air, land or sea force, but that was their justification at the time. And the first case was the to sort of weigh in on this opinion was the National Police Reserve case, which was filed to sort of say that this is violating the Constitution, of course. And this suit was filed, and the Supreme Court rejected it, and it found no issue effectively with the government's position, or at least it's refused to weigh in on this as a constitutional challenge, and it's sort of let this go on, and it's declined effectively to say this is unconstitutional, which has given the government some cover to just carry on as they were. So they've never directly come out and said that the SDF, I don't believe they've ever come out and said directly that the SDF is constitutional and fully within Article 9, but they've sort of declined to weigh in on it and define exactly what the limits of the SDF are, and it's a right to be a military and act as a sort of a military power. And but the position is that the SDF only has defence capabilities, and so things like Japan doesn't have a nuclear deterrent, for example, which very clearly you could call war potential. It's aggressive. It's very much an aggressive thing having a nuclear deterrent. Although you could of course make an argument that if it's mutually assured, and if that's how you defend yourself, as for example the United States defended themselves against Russia, you could argue by both saying, oh well, we both have the ability to reply. You could argue that's defensive, but I think the view's been taken that things like a nuclear deterrent are too much like an active, aggressive military force and war potential. And of course, there might be a strong opposition to having nuclear weapons within Japan anyway, in that sense. And also things like intercontinental ballistic missiles. The SDF does not have things like that, which would be used for attacks. And the government's very much, as I say, adopted this no nuclear policy. So it's very much just has the forces they would say they need for defence. And it's also worth mentioning that, as I mentioned earlier, American troops have also been stationed on Japanese soil, and they very much are a military, of course. So American troops are military, they're soldiers, but I suppose there's also again this sort of defence you could use of well, it's not Japan's military. They might be on bases within the country. They might, if there was an attack, be in a position to step up and act as a defensive army. Or they might even, under certain circumstances, use Japan as a base, but they're not Japanese troops, and therefore it doesn't violate the Japanese constitution, you could say. So that's an additional thing that's enabled the status quo to go on, the presence of American military troops on Japanese soil, as well as the SDF, which they say is purely for defence. Now, as I mentioned, how you could maybe argue that perhaps nuclear weapons are a deterrent and therefore you could argue that they're defensive. There's also a similar argument you could make with sort of defensive pacts, things like NATO and mutually assured defence treaties, where Japan has not been able to participate. And this is, again, something that perhaps over the years has frustrated America. When they first inserted this treaty, they didn't expect Japan to become, or they didn't really think about the future where Japan has become such a major economic power. It's a sort of a key ally of the West. It's a major modern power, Western allied democracy. Perhaps they didn't consider that. And so sort of now they're sort of very conspicuous by their absence in certain situations where they're not able to sort of agree these sort of reciprocal agreements in terms of defence. So, for example, if Japan were attacked, I believe the United States is committed by virtue of treaty to come to Japan's aid. But that only goes one way because Japan can't wage an offensive war. It can't engage in what you'd call collective defence, where if you attack one party, you're attacking all of them. Japan's very much conspicuous in their sort of modern alliance building aspect. They're sort of locked out of that. So there's sort of uneven aspect where if the United States were attacked, Japan can point to its constitution and say, well, we purely have a defensive military. We're constitutionally barred from entering aggressive war. So you could say that creates sort of an uneven situation from the USA's point of view, ironically, given that this was something they wanted very much and they introduced Article 9. It was sort of very much their creation. And so at times they've maybe been frustrated by that. There's also situations like the Iraq War, for instance, where the US wanted to build a strong coalition. They wanted other troops to enter. And Japan, of course, was barred from sending active military troops. One of the ways they sort of compensate, or they say they compensate and make up for it, is the fact that Japan has been one of the biggest spenders in terms of overseas development aid, ODA. So that's something that Japan can point to and say, well, we may not be able to contribute to sort of collective defence or engage in peacekeeping missions as much as other countries, or come to an ally's aid during war, but we're sort of making up for it, compensating by sort of spending the relative savings we've made from that into sort of overseas development aid and things like that. For example, in the case of the Gulf War, Japan vowed to spend $9 billion in the support during the Gulf War instead of a military contribution. So sort of saying, we can't physically contribute troops, but we'll send money instead, is something they've done. There was efforts over time to sort of maybe allow more of a peacekeeping effort, but there's sort of fears that peacekeeping troops are still troops. If they're attacked, they'll have to defend themselves, and then suddenly they're engaged in a conflict overseas, which is a sort of uncomfortable position given the constitution and the fact that they're branding these as a Japanese self-defense force. It sort of creates a difficult situation for Japan in that respect. They sort of went back and forth on this over the years, but in the end they did pass an International Peace Cooperation Act in 1992, which allowed the SDF to cooperate with international peacekeeping. And I believe in the Iraq War they did some very limited things. I think they sent some troops, for example, to engage peacekeeping, support infrastructure, things like that, even if they weren't. I think they carried protective weapons, but they weren't sent into active combat zones or deliberately sent into combat, but they were there present in Iraq in a limited respect, just to sort of support troops effectively. But again, this does pose the difficult question of what would happen if there was an attack on these Japanese troops and they're constitutionally barred from engaging in combat. It could create, if this were ever to come under the spotlight in a major way, a sort of an uncomfortable position for Japan. Another example of the way things have slightly broadened over time is in 2009, the Diet passed an act responding to piracy off the African coast to send the SDF to the coast of Somalia to guard, crucially, not only Japanese ships. So you could maybe make an argument that if the SDF is there to protect Japanese assets, okay, maybe they're not strictly within the Japanese territorial limits, but they're protecting their soldiers, protecting Japanese cargoes, Japanese citizens. So you can make an argument that's purely there for defensive presence. But crucially, they were ordered to not just guard Japanese ships, but also foreign ships. And the SDF was in a position to fire if guarded ships were approached despite giving warnings. And so obviously that goes a bit beyond what the original intent was when the SDF was founded, and their sort of defence claims around well, this is purely a defensive force. It becomes, you could argue, it's stretching a bit beyond that if it's very far from Japanese territory and it's defending not just purely Japanese civilians, but other ships as well. Something also to mention is that there have been efforts over the years perhaps to address this. Shinzo Abe, when he was in power as the Japanese Prime Minister, said this is something he wanted to address. He had a great deal of difficulty with this, I think because you need a 2/3 majority in not just one house, but both houses of the Japanese parliament in order to pass an amendment. And following that, you also have to have a referendum, which makes it very difficult to get something like this through. But he wanted, I think, not necessarily to entirely get rid of Article 9, but I think he wanted to effectively formalise the SDF. So I think what he considered was not just getting rid of Article 2, but I think one thing he considered was adding wording to the effect of, notwithstanding the previous two articles, Japan has a right to self-defense, or these preceding articles do not make the Japan self-defense force unconstitutional, or something like that. He wanted to acknowledge it, make clear constitutionally where the SDF stood and sort of roll back Article 9 and sort of formalise things in that respect. But this has not yet come to pass. There's been no amendment on this. There's nothing passed to change the Article 9, and there's been no vote. So despite efforts to have sort of a debate about this and roll it back, things are still sort of very much where they were. So you could make a number of arguments about the current state of Article 9, its practicality and its place in Japanese politics. You could make an argument that renunciation of war powers was always only ever going to work as a short-term measure, that it wasn't practical, and so they were always going to have to roll this back to some and just do what they've done, which is ignore it or make some effort to change the constitution. But then they were fully aware of these complications. People raised objections at the time, but they still decided to pass it, and ultimately it's the law of the land. So you might argue that in modern international politics, it's just not a feasible, realistic thing to have, but it's what they have on the books, and it's what they decided to pass. And they've had, you could argue, over the years, opportunities to roll this back, address it, engage in more of a debate, but it's still on the books. So that's sort of the situation you're in. You could also make a positive argument for this, that although they've effectively set it aside, they have stuck within. Although it's kind of a fiction, this idea that you're only allowed it for self-defence and that doesn't violate Article 9, they have stuck within it, though. And you could argue that maybe there's a sort of a clear self-imposed barrier that says, okay, maybe this is not strictly constitutional, but we're sticking to within Article 9, sticking within just having self-defensive powers. We won't go further outside of Article 9. And so you could make an argument that if you were to get rid of it entirely, it sort of removes that sort of self-imposed barrier. It's a clear sort of it's a thing that for decades Japan has obeyed by and broadly stuck within, of just having purely a self-defensive force. And so you could argue, even if it is ignored, that doesn't mean it's ineffective, in that it's clearly been a deterrent. It's been something that's been on people's minds, and there sort of seems to be this line in the sand that politicians, the military, that Japan in general has not been willing to go past. So you could argue that this sort of a symbolic, almost a mental barrier that is sort of preventing militarization in Japan going further. So you can certainly say that has had an impact and is to some extent effective by the fact that it's still in place. It's still something people think about, and it's still something that they haven't gone further in sort of rolling back, and it's something they've largely adhered to, this sort of self-imposed limit on how far you'd go outside of Article 9. Of course, you could argue that eventually, you could make a counter-argument that eventually something is going to have to give in this respect, and that what if one day the courts did decide to dive into this, which is something they haven't done up to present. What if there was a key case they ruled on the constitutionality of the military in Japan one way or the other? That would have massive, sudden and unexpected impacts. If they just suddenly threw out Article 9 under some pretext and said, well, this isn't an enforceable thing, and threw it out, suddenly there's no limit whatsoever on what military Japan could have. So, that would create a sudden situation. Equally, what if they suddenly said the self-defense force, the air self-defense, sea self-defense, and land self-defense, these are all clearly banned within the Constitution. They're all unconstitutional, and they all have to go. There'd be a sudden mad scramble to either completely get rid of an institution Japan's had for years, these 260-odd thousand members of Japan's self-defense force. What do you do in a situation like that? Or a mad scramble to, in a panicked fashion, rewrite the Constitution to allow them to continue. And it raises all sorts of awkward questions about the practicalities of what would happen in that situation. And so you could sort of argue it's sort of a legal thing that's hanging over Japan's head as long as they let this state of affairs go on. But as I say, it does seem to have a clear effect on the way Japan's acted over the years, these sort of self-imposed limits. So you might perhaps see a change in attitude if you were suddenly to get rid of it. So it's something you'd have to weigh up in terms of what comes next and what might replace it. Another argument, of course, is that by the fact that everyone knows that this is on the books, and it's been acknowledged over the years that there's not a clear self-defense in some quarters, exception to the Constitution, and the fact that everyone sort of collectively ignores it, you could argue that it undermines sort of the rule of law in Japan and constitutionality, and sort of, or you could even say it's a bad example on the part of the lawmakers to sort of continue to ignore it. Another interesting and inherent contradiction within the status quo is that there's not a strong level of support for getting rid of Article 9 or amending it. It might be perhaps, I've seen different opinion polls on this, but there's not like a clear majority for it, which is very interesting because the self-defense force was allowed to stay because sort of public opinion changed over the years. And I would imagine that broadly people in Japan accept it, which is such an inherent contradiction created by this situation, that on the one hand people were sort of happy enough over the years with the SDF and having them as to come to their defence if the worst were to happen, or to respond to emergencies, that sort of thing, and to respond in a national crisis. There seems to be a broad acceptance, as far as I'm aware, of the SDF. But on the other hand, there's also not a great support for getting rid of Article 9. And that seems so contradictory, that the SDF is against your constitution, but you're not in favour of amending the constitution. And that's the situation created by the status quo of letting this drag on so long, that there's sort of a contradictory position in public opinion, that most people perhaps support the SDF, but they're not happy to change the constitution to allow them, which again adds into the argument that maybe there is something behind Article 9 being effective even if it is ignored. It is sort of a mental barrier, or this self-imposed limit that you have on just having a self-defense force does seem to be effective. Even if you're ignoring Article 9 to an extent, you're not ignoring it completely. And maybe if you rewrote the constitution to say you could have just a self-defensive force, it's as over the years the SDF has been pushed in its limits of what it can do, maybe that could just lead to further the limits being pushed towards having a more conventional military, which is a whole different conversation, isn't it? So in conclusion to the question, why doesn't Japan have a military? Well, it does. It just doesn't call it a military. Despite it very much being against the constitution to have a military within Japan, I think collectively everyone decided it's for the best to just have this force for self-defense, and it engages with the idea that this force for self-defense isn't a military, which it is, and that it isn't against the constitution, which it probably is, but we don't know that because this has never been defined by the courts, which again is another collective thing. They've decided to not engage with this issue and sort of let the status quo continue. But that's the answer to the question. Japan, in essence, does have a military. They've just decided not to call it that and to just have this there for self-defense. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, guys. It's a little bit something different, but I really wanted to engage in this interesting topic and have a bit of a discussion about it. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast with your host, Luke Whittaker. Sayonara, goodbye.